Today we'll be looking at creating some event and command handlers for the bot, so you'll be able to quickly add new commands and features, as well as organize them neatly into separate folders and files. First, let's add a couple of folders that will be organizing some of the new files that we're adding today. We're going to have handlers, which will be where our command and event handlers will go. We'll have events, which will be where individual events will go, and we'll have a commands folder. And finally, we'll have a util folder where some extra things will go. Let's go ahead and first clean up our index. So we won't need any of this old code from before, so you can comment out or delete it, do whatever you want. But let's get right into some of the edits that we'll need to make. So first, we'll need to create a bot object, which will contain some extra information. You can call this whatever you want, but I'm going to call it bot. I'm going to pass in our client object here, as well as include some other information, such as a prefix, and also an array here. I'm going to call it owners, which is going to contain all of the Discord IDs of users that will be specified as owners of this bot. So you can go ahead and put your own ID here, but this is mine. Next, we'll be creating two Discord collections under client.commands, collection, and client.events, new Discord collection. So these will be storing all of our commands and events, and we'll be able to pull out specific commands and events from these later on. They're very similar to JavaScript maps, where essentially we'll be having the key value of each of these maps be the name of the event or name of the command, and the rest of it will be the other information, including the code that will be called whenever that event or command is triggered. And lastly, here we'll have the module.exports, and we'll include this bot variable here. So whenever we call the bot variable from other functions, we can go ahead and import in this index.js, and we'll be able to get that object. Now let's go to the handlers file, handlers folder, and we'll create our events.js handler. Before we get started with the events, we're going to go ahead and actually create another helper function. This will be helping us load in all the files from a directory. So inside the util folder, let's add a file called functions.js. In here, we're going to create a function called getFiles that's going to get all the files in a specific directory. Before we do that, we need to import in something called fs, which is going to help us read and write from a file directory, but in our case, we only need to read. So const getFiles is what I'm going to call the function. We're going to have the path of where this directory is, and the ending, which is going to be a string of all the files that end in this. So we have return fs.read directory sync. So we're going to read all of the information in this directory synchronously. I'm going to pass in path, and this will return an array of all of the file names. So here we're going to filter out anything that does not end with this ending that we specified. So each of the files, file dot ends with ending. So this will return an array of all the file names. And let's go ahead and export this. So module.exports is getFiles. Now let's go back to our event handler and write that out. So first thing we'll need to do is import in this new getFiles function that we wrote. So const getFiles equals require. We're going to go to the util folder. And here we'll only be exporting one thing, which is going to be this event handler. So bot reload and this. So what this bot object will be is essentially the same thing as what we have here, and this reload here will be actually a Boolean variable, which will tell us whether or not we are reloading or loading this in for the first time. I'll go into more detail about that later. First thing we'll need to do is get our client object from our bot. This syntax here is actually called a deconstruction. So the bot object contains this client variable, so we can pull that out by wrapping this in brackets. Next, let's actually grab our events. So let's call our getFiles, and we're going to pull from the events directory, and we're going to pick out all the files that end in .js. If this is 0, then we're going to go ahead and tell us that there's no events to load. And if there are, we're going to go through each of the files. So remember, this is still the file names. So F here is going to contain the actual file name, and I is just the index of that array object. For each of these events, we're going to pull in the information from that file itself. So all these files will be under events. So we're going to go to the events folder, and we're going to pull out that file. And then earlier we have this client.events object that we created here at the beginning in our index.js file. Here we'll want to set this to begin with the event.name and contain the event information. So each of our event objects here is actually going to have a property of .name, and that name will contain the name of the event itself. And now to handle the reloading, again, as I specified earlier, reloading is when we create our bot for the first time and run it. We want to load in all these events and commands, but later on, as the bot is running and while we're writing new code, we want to be able to call the reload command, and that will be essentially reloading all of the updated events or commands into our bot. So if we are reloading, we're going to delete first all of the information that was already loaded into the bot and then replace it with the new updated one. So the syntax is a little bit weird, so you don't have to worry about trying to understand it, but essentially what it does is it takes any of the old information in the bot. Here we're deleting it with the obvious keyword of delete, and then we're going to load it in with, if we're not reloading, then we're going to print out that we have loaded in this file or this event, so F loaded. There we go. And now finally, we need to actually initialize these event listeners. So down here, I'm going to write a function called init events. I'm going to pass in the bot object there. And then here, if we're not reloading, I'm going to go ahead and init those event listeners. We only want to initialize these event listeners at the very beginning once. Otherwise, we'll have extra event listeners that we will end up duplicating with. So this init events object is going to initialize all of our event triggers, for instance, like the client.onReady or the client.on message create functions. To do that, we're actually going to add in one other additional helper function. I'm going to call this trigger event handler. This will contain the bot object, an event, which will be the name of the event, and here we're using the ..args. So this notation actually is called the spread operator. So essentially what this does is if we pass in two variables here, args will just be undefined, or an empty array, sorry. If we pass in more than 3 elements, then any of the remainder parameters that are called when we call this trigger events handler will go into this args array. The reason we need this syntax is because some of the events in the Discord.js library use 0 parameters, while others use up to, I think, 2. So here we will first deconstruct the client object from the bot variable, and then I'm going to wrap everything in a try-catch loop. Try-catch, and first we're going to check if the client.events actually has this event. If it does, then we're going to get that, and we're going to run the actual event itself. So bot and the args. If it doesn't, then we're going to throw an error, and we'll say that event does not exist. And finally here for our try catch, let's go ahead and just log the event. You can handle it in a different way if you want in the future, but this is just how I've been doing it. In our init events, let's go ahead and again deconstruct the client object, and let's go ahead and initialize our ready event. So this is the same syntax that we had previously, except here we're going to call the trigger event handler, and we're going to pass in the bot and ready. Now let's go ahead and try running our bot. So index node index.js, and the reason it is not running is because we actually never called these functions. Right now only index.js is running. So if we go back to index.js, here we want to actually call these loading functions. So I'm going to go ahead and create another function under clients. We're going to call it load events, and we'll put bot reload, and these will require, so we're importing in the handlers that we created earlier. So handlers events, I'm going to call it with the bot reload. So this is creating a function. We're still not calling it. Now let's call it with load events bot and false, since we're not reloading it, we're just loading it in the first time. Now let's go ahead and run it again, and let's go ahead and check out our error. So it's happening in functions, but it's happening where we call the get files. So here, this should be events, not event. There we go. Now let's run it, and event ready does not exist. So we have not created our events actually in here, but the rest is all working. So now let's go ahead and do that. So ready.js, and here let's go ahead and export this. So as we specified earlier, the name, we're going to call it the same as the file. Make sure these two match, otherwise your bot won't work. And we're going to have a function defined as ready, and we're going to pass in the bot variable. And here we're going to console.log logged in as, I'm going to print out the bot.client.user.tag, and now let's go ahead and run it. And there we go, we are logged in, and our bot, as you can see, is online. Now let's go ahead and try creating our command handler. So in our commands file, let's go ahead and first create our command so I can show you what the structure will look like. So let's create a new file, new folder called info. In here, let's create a file called ping.js. So in this file, we'll have module.exports, and it's only going to contain one command. We'll name it ping, of course. Again, make sure this matches your name of the file, and we're going to have category of info. I'm going to put permissions. So this array of permissions is essentially going to contain any of the permissions that the member is required to have in order to execute this command. I'll go into more detail into that in a little bit when we actually code the information in the message create event handler. And in here we'll have a property called dev only. So this is going to be a bool. If the dev only property is true, then only the people that have the user IDs that match the ones that we define in index.js under the owners, which is right here, will be able to run this command. So we don't want that here, so that's false. And lastly, to actually run the file, here we'll be having a couple of things passed in. We'll have the bot object itself, we'll have message, and we'll have args. So this is again the deconstruction syntax. So we're passing in this should be client. We're passing in a bot object, and the bot object contains all of these variables inside of it. And so we're pulling out the client object, the message object, and the args object all out of that bot object that is passed in. And so we can go ahead and return with the actually message.reply with pong. Okay. Now let's go ahead and actually code up the command handler and actually load it into our bot. So if we go to handlers, let's go ahead and add a new file. We'll call it commands.js. In here, first thing we're going to do is again get our files, require util functions. And here we're also going to need to actually import in this fs package, because this time, unlike the event where we directly have the name of the event and the file under it, we actually have subfolders, which is our categories. So it'll be a little bit more different. So let's go ahead and pass in the same thing as our events here. And then let's go ahead and get our client object. And here, let's go ahead and read the directory of the commands. So same as before, except this time it's command slash. But the difference here is that this, after we call it, is not actually going to get the name of these files. It's going to get the name of these folders that are under commands. So we're going to want a for each, and these will be the categories. Category. And here we'll want to actually get the files. So these will actually be under commands and under the directory that we specified. So the category name and then .js. So this is going to go through, so this is going through each of the is going to give us each of the subfolders, and then we're going to go through each of the subfolders to grab each of the files from those subfolders. Now with the files, these are our actual commands. We can actually call this commands. For each command, so these are still files. So I'm going to define it as f and I. So f is the name of the file and I is just the index. Actually, we won't need that, so I'm going to go ahead and actually delete that. And in here, we're going to have the command. We're going to pull it. We're going to require it from that path. So commands slash the category slash and the name of the file. And then similar to how we set the events, here we're going to do commands.set command.name and the command itself. And lastly, here we can go ahead and console.log loaded, and total number of commands would be client.commands.size commands. And again, this time we still haven't added the reload. So to do that, similar as before, we're going to have in here a reload. If we're reloading, we're going to delete from the cache. So require.cache and require.resolve. Again, don't worry about this syntax if you don't understand it. This is not really too important. It should be category. And this is the file. And there we go. So this should work. And yeah, let's go ahead and go to index.js. And now we need to go ahead and add in the load commands. So client.load commands equals bot reload, require handlers commands, and we're going to pass in bot and reload. And here, of course, we're going to call that function itself with bot, and of course we're not reloading, so it's going to be false. So if we go under our events, we did not actually add in the message create. So in here, let's go ahead and add message create.js, and under here we will first import in Discord, and then we'll go ahead and define the function itself. So name, this is the message create, and the run will have a function that will handle all of the running of the commands. So run all. So this essentially will get triggered whenever the message create is called. So let's go ahead and set that up. So if we go to events here, under init events, we want to go ahead and add a listener for that. So client.on, this will be message create. We will have trigger, event handler, bot, and message create. Let's go back to the message create file. And here, let's go ahead and call our commands. So first, again, let's grab our client object from the bot. Don't need the comma. To simplify things, we're going to filter anything that's not set in a guild. So if it's sent in a guild, anything that's not set in a guild. So if the guild object does not exist as part of the message, we know this was not sent in a guild, so we can return. If the message's author is a bot, so this will be true, then we also want to ignore that. So essentially we're ignoring any kind of messages sent by bots. And of course, if the message content does not start with our prefix, then we want to ignore that message as well. And finally, now we can actually pull and try to initiate this command. So first thing we'll do is try to split up this message into arguments and try to pull out if that command exists. So args equals message. I'm going to take the content. First we're going to remove the prefix from the start. So bot dot prefix dot length, and then trim here is going to pull out any of spaces before or after, and we're going to split this with a regex here. So this regex operator is going to split by any kind of spaces. So if I send in something like if my message was like let's say n dot ping hello, what this will do is first this slice will take off this prefix, and then this trim will take off any spaces before or after. There's none, so it doesn't matter. And then split is going to split this into an array. So ping will be its own string and hello will be its own string as well. Okay, now let's go ahead and grab the actual command. As you saw before, the first element of that array is actually the name of the command that we're trying to call. So we have command string equals args.shift, and we're going to call to lowercase. So the shift function is pulling out that first element of that array and then removing it from the args array and putting it into this variable. And the to lowercase we're calling just in case, say you want to call ping with a capital P instead of a lowercase 1, it'll still trigger the same command. Next, let's actually grab the command itself from our client.commands object. So the command string. And of course, if that's invalid, then command will be undefined. So if command is undefined, that means that wasn't a valid spelling or wasn't a valid command. So we can return and ignore that message. Otherwise, now we can go ahead and do our permission checking. So first thing we'll do is check if there is a requirement of the dev only. So if the command.dev only property exists and it's true, then we'll need to check if that user is part of the bot owners. So here we have the owners, and we can check if owners doesn't include them, doesn't include the member's ID. So if the command requires them to be a dev and the owners does not include their ID, then that means that of course they don't have permission. So we'll return message.reply is only available to the bot owners. And next we'll add in the other permission check. So if command.permissions, if that array is defined, then we're going to see if the member is missing any of the permissions that we are requiring. So we're going to take the member object permissions.missing command.permissions. So this we take the member object, we get their permissions, and this .missing function will take any of the commands that are in here, specified in here, that are not existing in the member. Then any of those will be returned in an array. So if the array is empty, that means we meet all the requirements, or there's no requirements necessary. If there's any elements in that array, that means we are missing some permission. So if the length of that array is not equal to 0, we know we're missing some kind of permission. So we can return message.reply, you do not have permission to use this command. Okay, Now let's finally call our command itself. So I'm going to wrap this into a try catch, and I'll show you why exactly in a moment here. But here in the run, we're going to pass in a couple things. As you saw in our ping command, I'm going to put this off to the side so we can reference it. We have the client, the message, and the arg. So here we want to pass in the message and the args. But as you see, we also want the client and the other objects to be passed in. So we're going to go ahead and also pass in the bot. But if we do this, the client won't be there directly. We'll actually be passing in bot and having to pull out the client from the bot itself. So instead, we can go ahead and use a spread operator here, which will split bot up into its individual components. So we're able to directly fetch it here, including the client itself. And lastly here, let's add our catch. And here, let's convert it first to a string. Error.toString. And in here, there's one trick that I've kind of created from after coding many Discord bots, and this is we can add manual commands. So I have defined that any of my errors that start with a question mark will be an error that was triggered by me manually, and will return that information back to the user. So error message, we're going to go ahead and remove that question mark. So that's what the slice command does. And then we're going to send that error message to the user. So let's go ahead here. And otherwise, if that did not have a question mark at the beginning, then it was not triggered manually by me. So let's just console.error that. There we go. So now let's go ahead and run this, and I think it should work. Let's see. There we go. This time it is loaded in, and we do have our event listener. As you see, message create.js is loaded. So let's go ahead and take a look and see if this does run. So run n.ping, and of course we don't get any results. Let's take a look at what happened. Message.guild is undefined. So if we go here, okay, I know exactly what the problem is. If we go to handlers and under events, one thing that we forgot to do here is pass in the message information here. So under message create, we have to remember that that takes in an additional message. So we can go ahead and pass that into there. It was missing that information, therefore the message was undefined. So let's try that again. And n.ping, and there we go. We get a pong response. And there you go. You've created your events and command handlers, and now all you need to do for the future, if you want to add additional commands or events, for commands, all you need to do, create the category, name it whatever you want, and add this into there. And then for events, all you need to do is create a new file, put in the information you want, and of course in the handlers events, you want to go ahead and make sure you add in the client.on. I will link a neat cheat sheet for the events if you want to read up on that. It contains all of the different events that Discord.js has, as well as the type of parameters that it takes in. So that was very helpful to reference. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have requests for what I should include in my next one, please do let me know. But I do plan on going into buttons and / commands next. So it's going to be very exciting. But do let me know if there's anything that specifically interests you. And lastly, I'm creating a Discord support server for you guys, so go ahead and check that out in the top right hand corner of the video right now. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.